Welcome to Tabadlab's 20th Policy Roundtable. My name is Amber Shamsi, and I am Head of Communications at Tabadlab. And today we're talking about the Afghan peace process, or more specifically, we're talking about the Doha peace process. Whether a new administration coming in, whether Joe Biden taking oath in January means disruption or continuity. What is the future of this peace process? What impact it will have on Pakistan's position as well, and what the Afghans feel about it. So we're bringing all these three strands together in one conversation about disruption versus continuity, and whether we can think in terms of these two binaries or not. So I'd like to introduce a fabulous lineup of panelists. We have Arif Rafiq, who's the president at Vizier Consulting and a fellow at the Middle East Institute; Kamran Bukhari, who's the director of analytical development at the Center for Global Policy; Kate Clark, co-director of Afghanistan Analyst Network; Ursula Nemeth, who's the director of the Afghanistan Research and Evaluation Unit; and last but not least, Nemethullah Bijan, lecturer in public policy at the Australian National University and a senior research associate at Oxford University. Thank you so much for giving us your time. Very important subject, and I know that while Iran seems to be paramount in terms of the region, Afghanistan is a continuing process. And just very recently, there's been a story about how President Ashraf Ghani as well has refused to let peace talks move forward, even though these peace talks are really, really important in terms of the next phase, which is actually sort of the more technical sort of terms as well. So I'm going to begin with you, Arif, because one of the questions and one of the angles that's been talked about in terms of President Ashraf Ghani's refusal to allow the peace talks to move forward is whether a new incoming president has anything to do with it, and does it signal disruption?
Well, thank you, Amber. Thank you for thank you. I'd like to thank you and the folks at the Tabadlab for organizing this panel. There's some, the other panelists are people who whose work I value, and I'd very much I could simply just stay quiet for an hour and a half and listen to them and benefit from their insights. But since you asked me a question, I'll respond. Well, the transition of power in the United States from one government to another certainly adds a high degree of uncertainty to the Afghan reconciliation process. So the first phase of this broader sort of pursuit of an endgame in Afghanistan concluded on Leap Day in February of 2020, and February of earlier this year, and the United States and the Taliban agreed to exchange a full U.S. withdrawal of Afghanistan in exchange for a Taliban counterterrorism guarantees. That's essentially the crux of that agreement. Now, the intra-Afghan talks were supposed to begin several weeks after that. It took 6 months for that process to commence. It's taken another few months for the framework agreement for those talks to be concluded. It still isn't entirely complete as far as what we've heard in terms of press reporting and all that. And it's actually unclear, as to whether the Biden administration intends to follow through on the agreement with the Taliban. So many in the U.S. policy community are kind of framing it as an agreement between Trump and the Taliban, not an agreement between the United States and the Taliban. So in many of the analyses we see from individuals who could very well end up in the Biden administration, many of them don't even mention the existence of this Doha Accord. And they presume that the United States will have an opportunity to perhaps revise the agreement, or just abrogate it, or kind of just ignore it. And so that's a real uncertainty that we have. We're entering a period of uncertainty. We don't quite know where the administration stands. There wasn't really any pressure on the Biden campaign to articulate an Afghan policy during the campaign, just because Afghanistan has receded in importance in the Washington policy debate and really doesn't have any importance in terms of the electorate in the United States. So we really don't know what's going to happen in the next few months. And I think that also reflects the hedging strategies among that we see from many players in the region.
All right. I mean, I think that's pretty significant. The fact that, given that the Afghan government has also been extremely uncomfortable with the Doha agreement as well, the language of the agreement, so there have been two separate streams here. And I think, Dr. Hemantullah, if I could bring you into this conversation, um, does this mean that the Doha agreement stands void? I think your mic is on mute. Yeah.
Thank you, Amber. Great pleasure to be a part of such a distinguished panel. And also, I thank the lab for having me. When it comes to the Doha peace process or the US-Taliban agreement, what I would call it, not disruption, continuity and disruption, I would call it continuity and change. Why is that? First, if we look a little bit back, the process was initiated under the Obama administration, and then Trump reinitiated that process. But what a different approach, which was highly personalized and shaped around the presidential campaign of President Trump. And also coming to when it comes to the context or content of the agreement, it has some flaws, which was highly criticized both in Kabul and Afghanistan and Washington by major Afghan experts and policymakers. One was that it was highly politicized, not based on the realities of Afghanistan. The second one was that it bypassed the Afghan government, which became a major problem when coming to the prisoners exchange and then agreeing on the framework for the negotiation. So that was an issue. And then another problem with the entire process, Doha peace process, has been that it neglected the need for a ceasefire, and a reduction in violence became a green light to continue the violence. So now the process is highly criticized, and because of the continued high level of violence, the process seems fragile. So the question now here is, in terms of continuity, I think there will be continuity in the process when it comes to broader objectives. However, the approach will differ under President Biden, and in that case, there will be less pressure on the Afghan government, and it's expected to become an active actor and have more lead in the process, which was bypassed by the President Trump's administration. But instead, there will be more pressure on the Taliban, and also they will be held to account for the level of violence if they commit. And so within that framework, when it comes to the troops withdrawal, the American troops, also the approach may differ, but yet we are not certain. Also, we should not ignore the fact that the new US administration will be preoccupied with domestic crises such as the COVID-19 and also recovery of the economy. I would like to conclude in a sentence that we will see more continuity and change in the process.
Continuity and change in the process. But Kate, do you think that also means is it going to start from scratch? Is it going to start midway? At what point do you think this will continue, and especially given, as everyone has pointed out, including Arif right at the top, that Afghanistan is not really perhaps not priority at the moment.
Yeah, well, so much has already changed. I mean, the very fact that Donald Trump and Special Envoy Zalmay Khalilzad decided to speak unilaterally to the Taliban, to make a unilateral agreement to withdraw American troops, beyond what had been agreed with the Taliban, even as the Taliban have intensified their violence against government workers, government forces, and other civilians living in government-controlled areas. The ground has already shifted, and by the time that Donald Trump leaves office, the number of US troops should be down to 2,500. Not very many. Even when you include NATO troops and contractors, that's not many. Bases will have been closed. And that has fundamentally already changed the nature of the battlefield and the balance of power in Afghanistan. The Taliban have been emboldened by this, by their dealings with America. And the Afghan National Security Forces have been weakened and demoralized. And that's just a fact of life. I mean, I think if you talk to people inside Afghanistan, you will find that people who live in areas that were often absolutely wrapped up in conflict, so areas where the Taliban were largely in control, which saw a lot of US airstrikes and night raids, US-supported night raids, those areas are a lot calmer now. People there generally are much more optimistic. They can get on with their farming in ways that they couldn't do before. You look at other areas, contested areas near army bases or police checkposts, they're seeing a huge increase in violence. Horrible violence. You see the Taliban moving in, consolidating their rule. And then you've seen these waves upon waves of attacks in the urban areas that look to be insurgent, but they're not claimed by the Taliban. And they're attacking mid-tier government officials, police, women activists in particular, human rights activists, women policemen, journalists. And we've seen increases in the use of magnetic bombs in the cities and car bombs. So many people in Afghanistan are feeling already under siege. They're feeling that the peace process is doing nothing for them. It's just a talking shop. And they're very concerned about what the Taliban's real intentions are. And just to end this segment, I don't know if the audience may have seen a recent interview with Zabiullah Mujahid, the Taliban spokesman, and he talked about the jihad, as he calls it, not ending when all the foreign forces leave, but only ending when there's an Islamic system. And not only government forces, but government workers, he said, he asserted that it's Islamically legitimate to kill them. So we're not hearing sort of peace-loving, conciliatory words from the Taliban. We're hearing, or at least we are, but we're also hearing these warmongering statements. And on the ground, we're seeing absolutely the violence being ratcheted up. So I think there are big questions about Taliban intentions. It's clear that they wouldn't have come to the negotiating table, and frankly, neither would the government without the Americans wanting to leave and to have some sort of system for leaving. And the Americans gave it so much in exchange for getting the Taliban just to the negotiating table, not just the troop withdrawals, but also the 5,000 prisoners, the Taliban prisoners that were released. And what we see, as I said, is that the Taliban are much stronger already from this process. And if the Doha talks don't work, I think what everyone's really fearing is an intensification of the war. And unfortunately, we all, and some of us very personally, have memories of the very bitter stage of the war in the 90s when the Soviet Union withdrew and Russia withdrew its aid money. So that's if you like, the alternative future that people are fearing if the talks don't work out.
Thank you. Sobering sort of realization here that with escalation in violence. Already the Trump administration, in its sort of waning days, has announced a troop withdrawal as well. So, Ursula, I'd like to get from you a sort of mood in Afghanistan in terms of Joe Biden coming in, given that the Taliban are negotiating from a position of strength, escalating violence, concerns about peace. Could you talk to us about the mood there?
Thank you, Amber, and thank you, Tabadlab, for having me also in this distinguished panel. As other panelists have mentioned already, I think when it comes to Afghans and the way that they view the US administration change, I don't see any particular change or any significant move so far. So everyone is in the mood of wait and see. But as both panelists, Kate and Nemat, have mentioned, I want to emphasize on the fact that for Afghans, this whole Doha process that is focus of our discussion today has not really brought any significant changes towards peace, because violence against Afghans have continued. It has actually intensified. We have target killings, as it was mentioned. And so one tiny little hope that we see in comparison to Trump's administration for Joe Biden's administration is at least some level of loyalty, some level of values that the Trump administration or its Democrat party mostly, or leaders within the Democratic Party, are having for, respects for democratic values, respect for human rights, and so forth. So there is that tiny little bit of a hope from the a little more from the Biden administration that they should not follow a kind of rule for this so-called peacemaking that is completely stepping over any basic values for humanity in Afghanistan, because based on what you see from the Taliban side is, as we speak, is almost no respect for anything such as life of children in the hospitals, life of students in the universities, lives of ordinary Afghans, or even lives of people in the Afghan National Security Forces. So they are all equally being targeted, systematically being targeted and killed in one way or another. I think that's really is a little sign of hope that Biden administration at least learns the lessons from this personalization of the whole peace process, handing it over to one individual who comes with a baggage of stories and God knows competitions or whatever's. So the hope is to really have someone more dedicated. I sometimes in my conversations with the people in the US mentioned that the best person to take the lead of negotiations to get some practical results out of it is a former veteran, somebody who has been on the war front, who knows the pain of this war. Because unfortunately, as we see now, neither on the Doha, on the Taliban side, nor on the any other side, I mean, you see people who have direct people on the war front being killed, getting killed on a daily basis. So the Taliban leadership are enjoying the luxury of Doha, and this is why it's not a real priority for them. And they try to maximize their gain for this future that's only themselves can probably understand. We so far did not understand what is the desire of an Islamic system that they want, because according to our constitution, we do have an Islamic system at the moment. Reforms, yes, why not? But does reform require human killings of Muslims all across, killings of innocent civilians all across? Certainly not. So there is a serious expectation here from our regional players, Pakistan, Iran, or others who have somewhat significant role in this process, to seek more practical and genuine ways of getting us out of this cycle of violence, or else, as Kate Clark mentioned, and I fully agree, we are really doomed. And we are, to be honest, I'm remembering the 90s. I don't see much difference between now and the 90s. We were gradually going towards the way of collapse back then, that we are at the serious risk that we will be walking towards that as we speak.
Thank you. And Kamran, I'd like to bring you into this conversation now and bring Pakistan into the conversation because central to bringing the Taliban to the negotiating table, Pakistan was central and has been in this entire process. It was also central in the 90s as well for very different reasons. How do you see Pakistan's role playing out once Joe Biden comes in terms of Pakistan's role, and then we'll talk about the region as well.
Thank you, Amber. Thanks for having me, and I'm pleased to be with so many distinguished colleagues. To answer your question, I think like everybody else that's involved in this process, the Pakistani state is also looking at this as saying, okay, we just don't know what the intentions are of the Biden administration. How important are the Taliban talks, considering there's so much on their plate as they come in. As Nematullah was referring, COVID takes precedence. The Biden team has made that very, very clear through its statements and its actions already. So the question is, from Pakistan's point of view, how important will this be for the United States? As we are talking, another conflict is brewing next door in Iran, and that's probably going to take a lot of bandwidth of the Biden administration. I mean, this process with the that was supposed to happen anyway with Iran, and it's now become complicated with the assassination of their nuclear scientists. So there's just so much going on. Now, Pakistan's role obviously is important, but I think that Pakistan's role needs to be sort of examined in more detail in terms of what is it that Pakistan can do to ensure that the negotiation process doesn't falter. Obviously, the Biden team has to take the lead, the Biden administration, but then Pakistan has to balance between Kabul and the Taliban. And we know, over the years, the relationship with the Taliban is not what it used to be. It's waned. The Taliban have evolved. They have far more, if you will, foreign patrons or allies, or at least partners that they can deal with. They've gained a lot of recognition through this negotiation process. They have relations with the Gulf states, with Turkey, with the Chinese, with Russia, with the Europeans. Everybody's invested in making sure that once the United States pulls the plug, that everything wouldn't collapse. And so the Taliban aren't so dependent on Pakistan. So the Pakistani influence isn't what it used to be. And so the question is, will the Pakistanis force the Taliban to stay the course in terms of talking? One of our colleagues just mentioned that, referenced Zabiullah Mujahid's statement that, the jihad will continue. Is that just rhetoric, or is it, serious? To what extent? That's something that should worry Pakistan. Pakistan shouldn't just look at this sort of as an opportunity to, have influence or regain influence on its western flank, the strategic depth that, we talk about all too often, but also as a threat. If this thing doesn't work, then Pakistan has a huge insecure border. Civil war in Afghanistan has destabilized Pakistan over the decades, and we're just going to enter a new chapter. So I think for Pakistan, this is a major national security threat. And the hope is that, the Biden administration, maybe not looking at it at the same level of priority, but would give it its due. And as other speakers have noted, this has been usually unusual for a Trump administration to just sort of go in so quickly, fast track the negotiations, get Mullah Brother to be released by the Pakistanis, and then start this process and take it so quickly to a point where you have an interim agreement, and then you're trying to get the Afghan factions on board. The assumption obviously was that they'll get reelected. Now that they're not going to get reelected, how will the Biden team approach this? Obviously, they're going to be under far more pressure from their constituency to not give into the needs of realpolitik, where you need to negotiate with the Taliban, and you're willing to sort of look the other way in terms of human rights, women's rights, and so on and so forth. And, the process of democracy. That's going to be difficult for the Biden administration to pull off. So I don't think that the Biden administration has a really clear idea of how they're going to tackle this.
So the same thing that Arif has been saying, and that sort of is a good circle back to Arif as well, right at the, we had that, at the top of the conversation, because what is clear is that there's a potential for a huge mess, and that will have an impact not just in Pakistan, where I'm sitting, but obviously in the region as well. Do you think, Arif, and has the credibility of Khalilzad deal been shredded? Has it been destroyed? Is it a mess that's been left behind? How can it be salvaged?
You mean his credibility in Washington or
deal.
Elsewhere? In terms of how people view him in Washington or elsewhere?
I was talking about the Doha deal as well, because I mean, all our panelists seem to agree that it was just not feasible. It wasn't workable. And that seems to be being proved correct. It's being proved as well as we move into the new year. But, the question really is, how can this be salvaged now? Because the potential for a huge mess is, has a broad impact.
Yeah, I think in some circles, Zalmay Khalilzad has become a bit of a controversial figure. Certainly the Afghan government in Kabul really has disdain for him and would like to see him gone, to be a bit frank. Some in Washington would like to have his job. And so you can kind of get that sense from these anonymous quotes that appear in publications like the Washington Post. So that is a sort of natural part of any transition of power. People are out of government and want to come back in and get that job they've been coveting for some time. So there are those aspects as well. The Doha deal, I think when the Biden administration sort of coalesces and assembles a national security team, they'll likely, conduct a review of their Afghan policy. And I think in the end, they may see it as kind of a least bad option. In the end, the United States needs to kind of just, determine what are its core interests in Afghanistan. Is it to contain, defeat, dismantle al-Qaeda? Is it to ensure that Afghanistan remains a kind of a republican, somewhat democratic system with elections and some degree of representative government? Is it to protect the rights of Afghan women? There are a lot of these sort of strands that animate U.S. policy toward Afghanistan. But in the end, we're coming towards some sort of transition period, an inflection point. And, what the Doha deal has forced upon the Biden administration is a tight window in which they have to make a choice. The U.S. Taliban deal requires that all U.S. troops are out of the country, out of Afghanistan, by the end of April. So the Biden administration has to make an assessment. Do they want to pull all the troops out by then? Do they want to abrogate the deal? Do they seek to renegotiate it or kind of extend the timeline? I've recommended a kind of a standstill agreement that preserves the deal, but gives the United States and the Taliban more time to kind of fulfill their respective requirements. And then as a result, gives the Afghans greater time to move their own intra-Afghan process forward. But I think in the end, there are probably a range of opinions about Zalmay Khalilzad, the person, and the process he has led, and the agreement he has helped secure. But in the end, setting all that, what matters in the end is what is important for the United States. How best can it allocate its time, its resources, and its personnel, and what's most important. If the Taliban are able to deliver in a very meaningful way on these counterterrorism guarantees, and which is the basis for which the United States entered Afghanistan, then I think many in the Biden administration will probably conclude that the withdrawal makes sense. Then, these are people who dealt with the Afghan war for the period from 2008 to 2016. So they're not newcomers to this, and though we don't see too much commentary from many of them on Afghanistan. We haven't seen too much commentary from them on Afghanistan in the years since many of them have been out of power. I think what we can see is that probably among some of them, there is a realization that the investment the United States has made in Afghanistan has kind of peaked in value in terms of there was a surge in from 2009, 10 into 2013 and 14, and the United States had around 100,000 troops in Afghanistan, and what was achieved. So I think there's probably a recognition that our expectations for what we can achieve there have to be more practical, based in reality, and that will kind of sort of govern how the Biden administration pursues the Afghanistan policy question. And in the end, I think it's going to be a very fraught debate. It'll be very contentious, and there will be these kind of memories of Vietnam reliving itself during these debates. But it's still it's a big question. We don't know.
Still a bit of a question mark, but Dr. Tabadlab, if I could come to you on this, because I think it's interesting. If there's a tight window of opportunity, what do you think are the priority areas, which, or at least the conditions for renegotiating, or the conditions for setting a new sort of tone for the peace process?
One of the important aspect also colleagues mentioned in the panel will be accountability. So far, we don't see any change both in the Taliban's attitude and behavior. So no compliance is taking place on the part of the Taliban in particular. So one of the important issue would be, especially as it was put forward, that the agreement is conditional based. Whether those conditions were met or not is clear to say not. So more accountability, that's one issue. And the second one is let the Afghan government to have an active role and lead a process. It represents the nation. And the third one is also when it comes to international engagement, it needs to appreciate some of the values, human rights, in particular the rights of women and the gains being achieved in Afghanistan. Also, I would like to put it in a way that today's Afghanistan is different from the 90s. And also from Vietnam, if we make a comparison, the case of Afghanistan is more close to the existing case of Colombia peace process, but more complicated because external actors are engaged in the process more than the cases in Colombia. So that's why these are the three areas, at least in the short term, can help. But one of the most important issue or factor would be a ceasefire. Why is that important? To build trust and also to maintain the momentum. If the level of violence continues, as is the case now, it's less likely that the current process will be sustained because it's highly fragile, and always there are reasons to withdraw from the process for both sides, especially the Afghan government, because there's a growing pressure inside Afghanistan asking the question, what does it mean to have this peace process while not having any change on the ground? So as Kate mentioned, that the level of violence has continued, and also violence has become ugly. And the news are very sad in Afghanistan. And I think that will also increase the pressure on the Afghan government. Even it would undermine the Afghan government to make difficult decisions. So when it comes to the outcomes, it's uncertain. And also, and at this particular moment, regional actors, in particular Pakistan, can play a constructive role, especially making sure that the Taliban will agree on a ceasefire. Although the argument is that the case that Pakistan is making is that it has influence, not control. But also when it comes to the Taliban's strength as military, coming to that point, I think a ceasefire could help to sustain the process, and it has been costly when it comes to human costs and also economic and so on for Afghanistan and beyond that. If the process collapses, I think the impact, it will not only impact Afghanistan but also the region and beyond.
Well, I'd like to ask a question here, because you said that Pakistan should play its part in terms of getting the Taliban to reduce levels of violence. But the argument that Pakistan makes is that it doesn't have the same kind of influence, not just control, but the same kind of influence it did, until a few years ago. So then, in which case, how do you see Pakistan playing its role in this transition period?
Well, at the initial process, bringing the Taliban, encouraging to engage in negotiations, it played a positive role, but that's not enough, especially when it comes to peace negotiations. Without having a ceasefire in place and the continuation of a high level of violence will be a risk which may collapse the entire process. And it seems more likely that Pakistan can play a constructive role, and so that has to be seen. But of course, it takes time, and it's difficult, especially given the uncertainty around what happened in the US concerning the election. It may take a little bit time, but at least all the parties of conflict or the stakeholders should be clear that a peace process should be about peace, rather than, especially when it comes to the Taliban, should recognize the realities of today's Afghanistan, and also it can be a tool to gain more international legitimacy. So when it comes to stakes, it's quite challenging. That the transition is much more difficult than was the transition from peace to war. And we hope things improve, but yet we need to see.
Yes, there are two kinds of transitions. The attempt to transition from war to peace, and then a key player, the US administration, a change in administration. I'd like to turn to you, if I could, I think there's an important question here because of President Ashraf Ghani's reservations about troop withdrawal. And if I could ask you, Ursula, what's your take on his fears, on his reservations? Because it does make sense. Are Afghan security forces prepared for a Taliban onslaught?
Well, thank you. On this reservation in terms of the troop withdrawals, I think it's not only President Ashraf Ghani's reservation. Majority of Afghans looking at the situation as it is developing are finding themselves completely non-represented in the entire of the US Taliban deal. We don't even call it a peace deal or anything, because it was more to provide an arrangement between the United States of America and the Taliban. And so there is no any other voice from Afghanistan there whatsoever, regardless of we call it an Afghan voice or an Afghan government voice from the Republicans. So in that case, I think the reservation is still there, represented by most of the Afghans, because we didn't see any move at this first phase of the negotiations and the result of it as the deal. As mentioned, the no signs of even reduction in violence. There was a significant reduction in violence 2 weeks before the US Taliban deal signing. That tells you something very important. That tells you that there is a level of monopoly over violence, and they had the opportunity, they have the capability of controlling this violence, but they leave it open because it was not part of the deal. So in the Taliban side, why should they reduce the violence if that's the only tool that keeps them alive, keeps them relevant to the process? So the moment they surrender to ceasefire, there will be no interest to talk to them, to keep them engaged. One point I would like to make before talking about the reservations on the government side is that the future-looking process requires definitely a couple of we see some absences there in this process, and a couple of roles that needs to be defined very clearly. In terms of absence, we are looking for more stronger civil society representation, meaning the representation of people who are not enthusiastic or obsessed about power sharing. The people you see most in the negotiation sides are mostly people who are having an interest in the future of power sharing. But that's why the stronger voices from the civil society, from the victims' families are not represented there. Secondly, in terms of roles, I think it's important to consider a variety of roles there. We don't have mediators in this process. I understand that both sides somehow agreed that they will talk to each other, which makes sense because, like mentioned in this panel, I think the conflict in Afghanistan is extremely complicated, meaning that there are so many players, so many countries have been part of this conflict. They have a direct hand in the conflict, financially speaking, safe sanctuary speaking, and others. And there are multiple of countries and players that they are involved in this. This is why to have a mediator, we have to think more about the technicality of, or the technical capability of individual mediators as opposed to countries trying to mediate, which is now an interest appearing. The second thing which is really missing in this process, and I hope the Biden administration learned from it, from the past and address this, is the guarantors' role. Who guarantees anything that is being signed or being agreed if ever there will be an agreement? We have seen a complete absence of Afghans. I've said that, but in terms of guarantors, I think it's really critical to identify people who have a hand. We were talking earlier about the influence. What about Pakistan not having influence over the Taliban? I see the point from the Pakistan side that there is less or limited influence, but I cannot accept simply that no one has no influence over this force. Let's put things in context. Where does the resources come from them? And my organization actually doing a lot of research on illicit economies. We do agree. Our research finds and highlights the fact how Taliban are sort of fed in terms of using the illicit economy, but that's not the only source. They have supporters in the Gulf area. They have supporters and they have individuals or personalities or powerful financial and political resources or sanctuaries, if not per definition the states themselves, who have a strong influence over the Taliban. That has to be used. This is the time. What are we waiting for if we see this level of Afghans being killed on a daily basis? So the role of guarantors is really critical, and guarantors should be defined in a way of people who will have leverages on all sides involved in the conflict. So it cannot be guarantors if they are directly engaged in this war, but they have an influence, and that can be easily defined in actors. Now, reservations, see, there is this, New York Times piece today coming out, and I saw the reaction from the government side about it and all that. In one way, I think, like people say, it seems like killing of the time. For Afghans, it's a full sign of frustration because we see no progress in this the process called peace process. We see ongoing and intensification of violence. And let me tell you very clearly that for Afghans, it's a joke to accept that Taliban have not done this or the violence is done by some third party, because there is no clarity on this third party and who they are and what is behind them and all that. I mean, we have evidences showing that basically there is a quite a significant level of monopoly over violence in Afghanistan when it comes to major causes of violence. Of course, there are smaller groups. There are here and there pockets of, crimes on the rise, pockets of proxy fightings happening, and others. But in general, there is a strong level. And I think the key at this stage to earn the trust of all sides in conflict is to really take a serious step towards an immediate ceasefire. That will ease up the next phases in this process. It's just required, like I said, the stronger roles from mediators who can facilitate and push to speed up this process. What we find it extremely frustrating is the slowness of this process, because every moment, every day, every week, every month that passes, we lose humans. We lose a percentage of our young generations on all sides of the conflict, not necessarily one side. And that means we lose Afghans. So that has to be really stopped. And then we can sort of think of moving forward. Thanks.
All right, I think you've raised quite a few important points, and I think in terms of moving forward, these are very, very significant. Kate, I'd like to turn to you, because I think the question of including mediators and guarantors is an important one. At the same time, Arif also raised a point about Zalmay Khalilzad and how people, as it happens in transitioning administrations all over the world, actually, between elections and oath taking, is that people are gunning for Zalmay Khalilzad's job. In the meanwhile, we have Antony Blinken being appointed as the Secretary of State nominee. We have Jake Sullivan as a national security advisor. Does that make a difference, or doesn't it? And is how crucial is Zalmay Khalilzad's role, given how key he was in terms of the entire process?
Well, as I said, I think already Khalilzad and Donald Trump have already changed the game in Afghanistan. They have basically engineered the removal of the Taliban's main enemy on the battlefield, or at least its weakening. This is very, very evident since the agreement was signed, that the US has largely withdrawn from the battlefield and the Taliban have been emboldened, as I said. They're able to mass in large numbers, consolidate territory, and we've seen these waves of violence. We looked my organisation looked at the attacks that looked to be insurgent but were unclaimed, and most of them were in the towns and cities, the provincial capitals. So I would say that already things have changed. And one of the reasons for doing that, I think this last tranche of American troops that are being withdrawn, is it limits Joe Biden's choices. From his comments in the past, we know that he was very against the surge. He was very against putting large numbers of soldiers and resources into Afghanistan, basically because he mistrusted the Karzai administration and its deep venality and corruption, and he didn't think it was a project that could be pursued with any success. He's been in the past. Actually recently, about a year ago, he was talking about having a much more limited counter-terrorism force on the ground. But of course, you need a partner. Even if you're just interested in Al Qaeda and Islamic State group, you need a partner, and you need a reasonably stable country to operate within. And at the moment, the withdrawal of US forces and the release of those prisoners, and the feeling that the Taliban have that they're pushing at an open door, that they consider themselves as mujahideen, and that as in the 80s when they defeated the Soviet Union, they're now going to be defeating America in Afghanistan. This is the narrative that they're selling themselves. So whatever Joe Biden wants to do, he will find his options limited. If he does want a reasonably stable Afghanistan in which a counterterrorism force can operate and which has stable partners, he will need to be supporting the Afghan government and security forces in some measure, and with much more limited means to do that. And as I said, with an emboldened Taliban. So I think everything's sort of been controlled yet again by the needs for the domestic audience in America. So policy in Afghanistan is set by whatever's happening in America, even if it's really bad for Afghanistan and very bad for Afghans. Just 1 minute. And that's likely to happen again. We like to have a pause while things get going, and that's absolutely reasonable. in the meantime, the violence goes up. And what I see in Doha doesn't really bear any relation to what's happening in Afghanistan. So we can talk about mediators, and I agree with Ursula that these things are really crucial, but only if there is good intentions from both sides to actually negotiate. And I simply do not see this. I see this whole arrangement as a means to get US troops out. I don't actually see the Khalilzad plan as actually aimed at getting peace on the ground. And actually what it has done is weaken the governments that the Taliban are pursuing a military victory. And just one last thing. I'm amazed that some of the other people on the lovely and distinguished and honoured people on this panel have assumed that Pakistan is pursuing peace. This is not clear to me at all, given the Taliban's intensification of violence. If you talk to Taliban, they will talk about ISI advisors, they will talk about their respite in Pakistan. They were absolutely enmeshed within Pakistani military policy is the Taliban's so-called jihad. And there may be people within the establishment who also favour a peace process, but that's not how it looks on the ground in Afghanistan. And it is something that, is always addressed. It's never it's never dealt with because of all the complicated ways in which Pakistan also interacts with the rest of the world. Mm. But it is absolutely an issue that could be faced. And just seeing one of the comments from one of the listeners, Dr. Barnett Rubin in New York, one question may be, if the Taliban can continue to pursue this military strategy, will they still have free passage across the borders? Will their leadership still enjoy safe refuge in Pakistan? And these are sort of concrete ways in which Islamabad could show that it is actually giving practical support to trying to end the war and to try and get a negotiated end to the war, which absolutely reduces the amount of human suffering.
Kate, I'd like Arif to respond to that in terms of Pakistan and whether there's been a shift within Pakistan in terms of how it views the Taliban and the peace process. But I'll just interject small question here, because traditionally what's happened is that winter has always signaled a sort of a pause in violence, and violence tends to escalate once again in spring. It's called the Spring Offensive. Do you think at least that does sort of give some kind of breathing room to rethink the Doha peace process or the peace process entirely?
It should do. In the last few winters, we haven't really seen that pause. We've seen a downturn, but not. It depends on the weather. We have seen early snow in Afghanistan, and if the passes are closed through snow, it becomes much more difficult for the Taliban to continue fighting. As we know, many Taliban fighters take the winter as an opportunity to go and see, particularly those who've got families in Pakistan, or they go back for talking to the higher ups in the organization. Always, every winter, we think, well, some of us think maybe this is the time where we can actually reduce violence permanently, that this lull that we do see in winter, even if it's less of a lull than in the past, can actually be made into some sort of more enduring reduction in violence. And I would absolutely encourage this as a time when rethinking could take place, where discussions behind the scene can take place, and everyone could start to take take Afghanistan seriously and peace seriously. And just one other thing, this is not a war where you have one side of the population gunning for its own forces and against the other. This is absolutely an unpopular war, and it should be able to be solved. There's enough people of goodwill and there's enough popular desire for peace that this war should not be happening, and it should be it should be able to be resolved, even though obviously the ways of doing that may be complicated, but this is not a popular war.
All right, Arif, I'd like you to respond to some of the comments that Kate made as well, because we know that Prime Minister Imran Khan has had a very clear idea of the way that he wants things to turn out in Afghanistan. He's always talked about the withdrawal of foreign troops. He's talked about an intra-Afghan, and Pakistan has talked about, the Pakistani Foreign Office as well has talked about an Afghan-led peace process. Do you think realistically, has anything changed, or is it really the same?
I think there have been some meaningful changes in terms of how Pakistan as a whole, when you combine, all the arms of the state, how it pursues, how it has approached Afghanistan. Prime Minister Imran Khan published an op-ed in the Washington Post a few weeks back, perhaps a few months back, basically calling on the United States not to precipitously withdraw from Afghanistan. So in the end, that is, that was a statement that was made keeping in mind that of the the April withdrawal deadline. So I think there is indication that the Pakistani government, even the Pakistani establishment, fears a kind of a vacuum in Afghanistan and fears a Taliban-dominated Afghanistan. So yes, the Taliban are a means of influence for Pakistan. In terms of Afghanistan, there is a relationship, a historic relationship between elements in Pakistan and the Taliban. That relationship has changed over the past decade. The Taliban have become more independent as a force. But at the same time, I think if we go back even to statements by General Kiani, who was a previous army chief in Pakistan, he had said, I think he gave a briefing to Pakistani journalists, and he said that Pakistan does not want a Taliban-dominated Afghanistan, because in the end, if the Taliban establish their emirate or their imarat in Afghanistan, then analogous forces in Pakistan will seek to do the same. And we've seen that Pakistan has been the victim of a Taliban-style insurgency beginning in the years after 9/11, and they essentially framed themselves as followers of Mullah Omar and individuals or groups that wanted to establish a pure Islamic system in Pakistan. And they deemed, just like the Taliban, the Afghan Taliban have declared that the Afghan government, which is an Islamic republic, is an un-Islamic regime. The Pakistani Taliban have done the same. So I think Kate is right to note that there is a continued relationship between elements in Pakistan and the Taliban, and that also perhaps relates to the issue of violence. But I think in the end, I think there's been a lot of changes since the 1990s. And while the Taliban are a means of influence for Pakistan, at the same time, it's a force that has come back and hit Pakistan in its face. And I think and hope that members of the Pakistani governmental leadership, have retained those lessons.
I'm going to take this question now to you, Kamran, and add Barnett Rubin his very specific question. He's asked, the Taliban leadership is based in Pakistan. Is there a point at which, in light of the Taliban's refusal to compromise, Pakistan could potentially arrest or restrict the Taliban's cross-border military capacities? Pakistan has also been, fencing the border along with Afghanistan as well. Pakistan has also been talking trade with Pakistan in light of Prime Minister Imran Khan's recent trip to Afghanistan. So it is also partly in Pakistan's interest for peace, if we're trying to move forward with trade.
Yes, Anwar, and I think that Barney has asked a really good question. And the answer to that is, look, Pakistan will not arrest the Taliban until it's in the Pakistani interest to do so. So what is a scenario in which the Pakistanis will have to do that? Well, the Taliban aren't listening to Pakistan to the detriment of Islamabad. So they're going on and they're not complying. War is happening in Afghanistan, which is hurting Pakistan. And then Pakistanis have to make a call. Do they, maintain this relationship, or do they pull the plug on it and say, what, this is too much, and we're gonna, not allow you to operate in this country. We're gonna arrest you. So that is a scenario that's a scenario that is an extreme one, where Pakistan is directly facing the physical onslaught, the fallout of the war. There's violence in Pakistan. As Arif was mentioning, the Pakistani Taliban, who will be energized by a resurgence of the Afghan Taliban on the other side of the border. So in that situation, I can see that happening. But as we've seen over the decades, these are not, these are very well-established relationships with the Taliban and the Pakistani security establishment. And I don't think it'll get to that. I think that the Pakistanis are calculating that, through that relationship, we may be able to shape their behavior. But then again, the Taliban don't necessarily have to listen to the Pakistanis the way they used to a long time ago. So the Pakistanis have lost that leverage, if you will, and that was the clear evidence of that was the fact that the Pakistani Taliban and the Afghan Taliban have relationships with each other. From 2007 until 2015, 14-15, Pakistan went through a massive domestic Taliban insurgency. And if the Pakistanis had that kind of leverage, that would have not happened. The fact that that happened shows the Pakistanis don't have the leverage. In other words, Pakistan is caught between a rock and a hard place. And at the same time, they are thinking that, okay, we'll be able to steer this. The relationship that really matters here is the one that the Pakistanis are forging or have been forging with the anti-Taliban elements. In the Afghan government, the various factions, the regional warlords that are part of the anti-Taliban coalition. How close will Pakistan have a relationship with them also determines how hard the Pakistanis can get with the Taliban. Just like the Taliban have more options, I don't think that the Pakistanis have developed those options to the level where they can say, okay, we have the anti-Taliban forces, we have their confidence, so we can apply and tighten the screws on the Taliban. I just don't see that happening. But it's an interesting question from Barney, and one that the Pakistanis have to think about. I mean, because I don't see this ending well. I mean, unfortunately, and I think without saying it, most of us are saying that this isn't headed in the wrong direction. And the Pakistanis have difficult choices to make. And I think there's a lot more expectation from Washington that somehow Washington will be able to play its role. And I think that could be a serious miscalculation on the part of Islamabad.
All right. But there's another question that's been being asked by our viewers. And because we're talking about perhaps sort of examining this from all angles. The question, and I will put this to Nebatullah, is from Saad Kayani. And he says, so is the violence just the Afghan Taliban? But we also know that Daesh has also been involved. And there's clashes between Daesh and the Afghan Taliban as well. So can we just hold the Afghan Taliban responsible for all the violence? What about Daesh?
That's an important question. And if we think of a best case scenario, and the Taliban and the government agree on a permanent ceasefire, that means reduction in the level of violence. Violence will continue in Afghanistan because there are multiple groups, and it is more likely that the Taliban fighters will not follow the leadership in Doha. So that's the concern. In addition, also given the fact that Afghanistan is the major producer of narcotic, that will sustain other groups and increases the incentive for the fighters in the field, the Taliban fighters, to make a shift. So this is a major problem. If we look at the cases of insurgencies around the world, a number of factors prolongs insurgency. One is access to sources of income or narcotics or illegal economy. And the second one is having access to safe havens. So in the case of Afghanistan, we can see both of them. And so now the process seems the peace process of Afghanistan to not be inclusive. I mean, it doesn't include all the fighters, those who are fighting or armed groups in Afghanistan or ISIS and other fragmented groups. That's one of the limits of the current peace process. But also on the other side, when it comes to broader participation of Afghans, also they're excluded because unlike other processes, they do not have a say in the process. For example, we would need a referendum in Afghanistan to give a chance to Afghans to have a say about a final deal in case if the process progresses well and both parties agree on a political settlement. We don't know yet about that, but at least also when it comes to the rule of Afghans or citizens and also other fighters, the process is not exclusive, and that's expected. Also, the discussions have been going on, saying that so the nature of war will change, will focus on terrorist groups. That's what it concerns, especially people in Afghanistan, that even in the best case scenario, it doesn't mean end of conflict in Afghanistan.
Groups. I know, Ursula, you've talked about it. I will come back to you because I want to now turn to Kate. There's been, given you've sparked off this debate as well about Pakistan's role, and then we know it's not just the Afghan Taliban that are responsible for all the violence. The question to you then is, the Afghan Taliban has positioned itself actually as being a sort of counterweight to Daesh as well, and yet at the same time it hasn't distanced itself from Al-Qaeda. I think your mic is on mute.
Yeah, well, Daesh presented itself as an enemy of the Taliban. It claimed that the Taliban was lightweight, not properly fighting the jihad. It was a, and also the fact that they had this Khalifa in Baghdad who claimed that he was above. Then I think Mullah Omar was still supposed to be alive, or at least the titular head of the Taliban. So yeah, clearly they are rivals for the insurgent space in Afghanistan, whereas Al-Qaeda have always been closely involved with the Taliban struggle. And we see now, I would say, it's going to be tricky for the Taliban to try and distance themselves from Al-Qaeda, but very easy to present themselves as enemies of Daesh. Al-Qaeda and other foreign fighters are still on the ground supporting the Taliban. It's difficult to talk about numbers, and often even nationalities are difficult. When the government forces talk about having captured Chechens, for example, this covers a wide number of nationalities in Central Asia and from Russian-speaking individuals. However, clearly the foreign fighters are still there. They're still operating to support the Taliban, and I can't see that much has happened since the US-Taliban agreement, in which the Taliban were only asked to give very vague guarantees on foreign groups. Which means that the withdrawal of American troops, which is conditional according to the agreement, the Americans could easily argue that the Taliban haven't fulfilled their agreements, or they could argue that they have, if they want to. And as military people in Kabul have said, the US does not need the agreement of the Taliban to stay in Afghanistan. So they can argue, Joe Biden can decide to argue either way if he wants either to withdraw US forces completely as per the deal, or to delay, or to say that the Taliban have broken the agreement already. But certainly, that relationship between the Taliban and Al-Qaeda was always somewhat unnatural because they come from such different Islamic backgrounds, Hanafi and Wahhabi. The Taliban in the 90s and early 2000s, when I was first in Afghanistan, really didn't like the Arabs, as they called them, or the foreigners, or the guests. And I think that's often continued, that unease about having foreign fighters in the country. At the same time, there's been intermarriage. There's been much closer relationships over the last 2 decades of insurgency, which has meant that the foreign fighters are much more embedded in the Taliban insurgency. I don't know if does that answer your question, Anbar? Or have I got off the point?
A little bit. Now I'll move on to Ursula now, because I think I want to come back to the point about mediators and guarantors. So we know that other countries as well have been involved in terms of this conversation, such as China, given Pakistan's role. There's been so when you say that countries should not be involved, what kind of could you specify what kind of mediators and guarantors that you're thinking of specifically, and other maybe case studies from other countries, or where conflicts like this have been resolved through mediators and guarantors?
Thank you, Amber. Like I said, I mean, I'm now throwing this for those who are in the process of rethinking hopefully continue the peace process, but rethinking it in terms of what could be done. So far, as we say, the assessment shows that this was more an exit deal rather than a peace deal, exit or withdrawal, as we were talking about it. So the kind of thinking I have when I'm raising this question of, because I think we sometimes observe the language to discuss or to focus between, mediator, guarantor, and facilitator. So far, what we see happening is a strong facilitating role, and I see the Doha, the Qatar government playing the facilitating role to an extent, together with Germany and Norway to some extent also being involved. But when it comes to mediators, I see more experts, individual experts who have the technical capacity to run a process of discussion. I think the government of Afghanistan and the Taliban both, because of the international and national pressure on both sides, have made this arrangement pre-US election to move people physically to Doha and just please everyone with the fact as if they are actually like spending days and hours talking. And now we are realizing, and of course, in the process also, we have realized that what happened. They had a contact group of 4 people from both sides. It took them how long? It's over 2 months, maybe even more than 2 months. They haven't even agreed on the principles of conversation. And for God's sake, people are being killed on a daily basis in this process. So a mediator is, to me, a definition of an individual or a group of experts who are having one sole capability of A, not being side to conflict or party to conflict in either way, military or politically, and B, having the technical capability of pushing both sides to rush, to run the process faster and not just relax and, take time for whatever, and have a defined period of time that on the principles of negotiations, we will have 5 days. We will work day and night, or for 1 hour a day, or 2 minutes a day, but we will complete this with a deadline. They are working with an open timetable, and that's not really what one would expect from a peace process. We are not here to write books and volumes of, observations of how the process went. We are here to stop the bloodshed. I don't see much efforts on that side. So this is more about the mediator. So, I mean, I'm again avoiding to use the country's name. I think in the planet, there are enough countries that haven't, plenty of countries have been part of this conflict. Fortunately or unfortunately, that's the reality. But there are countries that probably are not. So I will not go and advocate specifically for those. I will just explain my definition of what I mean by mediators and their role. When it comes to guarantor, then I have a different explanation for it. I think the guarantors should be people with some level of leverage over the conflict parties, from the United States to the Afghan government to the Taliban. So someone that could punish parties who are violating these rules, someone that could basically, have the kind of checks and balances in place to make sure that any agreement that is being made is operationalized. It's something not put on paper, but is something that is respected by both sides and implemented by both sides. I think these are mostly, so I would avoid, again, specifically naming the countries, but more talking about the content or the characteristic of these rules. I saw the chat room briefly. Sorry, sometimes I cannot access it. Some problem there with my computer, with my phone. That Barney has asked whether the UN could be. I mean, research and studies from other countries where UN have played a role shows not a very brilliant or successful role for UN to be played. I mean, maybe UN is the mechanism that characterizes what I'm explaining, maybe not, but one has to look into it. And my hope is that all sides to conflict, including the government of Afghanistan, including the other side as well, they look into this more seriously, because it's not a matter of the two coming to an agreement between themselves, but having some level of national, international, and regional guarantees to make sure that whatever they agree will have some sort of operational side to it.
All right, we're moving into the sort of final phase of this discussion as well. I'd like to turn to Kamran, you first. I think your final thoughts. I mean, we've talked about how the use of a large-scale foreign presence of foreign troops hasn't helped. Pakistan has limited leverage. It's an interesting idea. Cut off the Taliban source of funding, or trace it, follow the money. Is that one way of gaining more leverage over the Taliban?
Yes, and I think that there's more to it. I think that while I have personally criticized the Trump administration for fast tracking these negotiations, because that's not how you achieve your goal. Obviously, their motivation was related to the 2020 re-election calculus. But that said, I think if you look at the way in which the Trump administration sort of tried to approach this, without sort of, the partisan lens and whatnot, their goal was, look, if we can get these people to negotiate, and we have financial leverage over them. And this is something that Secretary Pompeo made very clear in his remarks at the opening of the intra-Afghan dialogue in Doha. He said, we'll be watching this very carefully, and we will be providing financial assistance accordingly, which basically meant that, we know the Afghan Taliban will, if they want to run a government, if they want to be able to rule Afghanistan in some shape or form, then they need to have international recognition. And more importantly, they'll need money. Okay, you fought your way up till now, but ruling requires you have to have some form of a political economy. And the assumption was that if you sort of hold the purse, and that gives you leverage, that you will make sure that they will behave. I think that was the logic here. And moving forward, I think that the Biden administration won't be able to sort of move away from that entire mechanism or thinking, because ultimately it's not like the United States is going to put troops back in. There's only so much you can expect from Pakistan. And so I think the United States will have to deal with this on a financial level, that, okay, if the talks make progress, we will continue to support you. And in the end, you need money, and we're the only ones who can provide it. And therefore, it's in your interest to behave, whatever that behavior is. I mean, the bottom line is, look, from the American point of view, the Afghan government has not been able to, succeed in making sure that the country is secure and neutralizing the Taliban. That's a reality, and we can go into, for the reasons, and there are many. But that is the bottom line reality. So the calculus of the Americans is, if we can get the Taliban into this mix, if they can become sort of, the policemen in Afghanistan and keep a check on foreigners, and then that's sort of the counterterrorism arrangement that a post-American Afghanistan will look like, and may even work. I mean, that's sort of the expectation on the American side. And therefore, that's why, use Taliban as a leverage against the of Daesh. And what is the future? Because otherwise this doesn't make sense. The Taliban are not going to accept sort of democratic governance as a model. A lot of us have said they want their emirate back, or at least as much as possible. So how do you maintain a lid on the chaos in Afghanistan? And the only way to do that is through holding that financial purse and saying, if you need this, then you need to do X, Y, Z. Will it work? That remains to be seen. But that seems to be the logic of the United States.
All right, Arif, final thoughts. Financial carrot and stick, is that one way forward?
It might be, but it's really unclear as to, I think that goes to the question of to what extent have the Taliban changed. In the 1990s, they were essentially a rogue actor in the global system, recognized by 3 countries. That level of recognition wasn't, seeking global legitimacy and, funding from the international donor community was not one of its top priorities. And even if there has been some change, some, acceptance of this need to assimilate into the global system by elements of the Taliban leadership, it's really unclear as to whether the rank and file really believe that. They've been fighting against a government that has been recognized by, the United Nations, the world community. They're an insurgent force. How do you bring those rank and file forces back into a system in which they're just, relegated to one country and part of a world community of nations? So, even if there have been changes among the Taliban leadership, it's unclear as to how deep those changes might be in terms of the Taliban as an organization. So certainly the United States has made clear that it will not fund a government in Afghanistan that works against its own values. But, I'm not sure as to whether, that is a meaningful tool to use against the Taliban.
Final thoughts again. The Afghan Taliban, they've been emboldened by this peace process. Where do you think, how do you think this should go? How do you think they should be controlled, so to say?
Thank you, Amber. It's very complicated when it comes to control or leverage. So the first one would be sources of income, as Kamran and Arif mentioned, because to a large extent, the insurgency in Afghanistan has been a rentier insurgency concerning the income from narcotics and other sources, and also kidnapping and so on. That's one factor that can help to subside the level of violence and also encourage the transition. And in addition, so that will be like a post-settlement initiative, how to reintegrate the fighter. That's something that will come in the future. And the other one would be how can a structure or actors which have the enforcement capacity can guarantee the process. So now we are talking about conditional agreement, the US-Taliban agreement, who is enforcing those conditions. It will be complicated. From outside, the Taliban seems like a unified, centralized organization, but it is quite decentralized, fragmented. And once the time comes, so we will see how the organization would work, the Taliban. And so one of the assessment is that the group is scared of a ceasefire because it may not be able to reinforce, and ultimately that may undermine its legitimacy. Also, the question of unity on the part of the Taliban is a major issue. When it comes to the actors, still the US can play a major role in the process, and the regional actors can play a role, some of them, but their role will be limited. And it comes to which actor can do what. But for that, we need like a clear consensus for a transition from the current situation to a more stable situation in Afghanistan. But I would like to end with a statement that we need to be realistic when it comes to peace process in Afghanistan. Otherwise, if we are over optimistic, we may neglect the realities on the ground.
Thank you very much, Kate. Some final thoughts from you, because this is we've talked about this multiple times. It has an impact across the region. It has the violence that could spill over. There's already trouble brewing in the Middle East. What's the way forward?
I don't have much hope, I have to say. I think we're looking at change. We're looking at a marked change in how the US and in particular deals with Afghanistan. And for all that people talk about the Taliban having changed, if you actually look at the areas on the ground where they're in control, they're the same authoritarian organization, very narrowly joined. Yes, they are absolutely part of the Afghan nation, but they're a very narrowly drawn force of largely, the dominance of southern Pashtun mullahs. Well, everyone has a religious education in the Taliban, but that dominance of particular Pashtun rural southern mullahs, yes, they're a part of the nation, but they're one part of the nation, and they don't brook opposition. It's there's no such thing as free speech in Taliban-controlled areas. You might be able to get them to change what they do on the ground. For example, you might get a temporary cessation in fighting to get your harvest in, or you might be able to get a girls' school reopened, or you might get beaten up for asking. And that's the reality on the ground. Very, very systematic tax collection, very organised. None of the revenues go back to the people. Nothing gets spent on schools or clinics. Those are still all funded by the government and with the international donors behind them. The Taliban is interested in military activities and in controlling the population, and that's about it. And Afghanistan has changed. It's not just in the cities that there's been a change; it's across the country. But if you've got a force that has military superiority on the ground, it carries a lot of weight in Afghanistan as to what it can impose and what it can impose on people, and particularly an organisation that's willing to use extreme violence to try and get its aims. At the same time as you've got a government whose forces are weaker than they ought to be, and leaders who are still, many of them still trying to pocket revenue, still squabbling over power, squabbling over appointments. Ultimately, what happens in Afghanistan is obviously it's the responsibility of Afghans of all sides, but the international and the regional context doesn't make it easy. It's not as if there's like a warm embrace from the region or internationally for a peace process. And even though, as I said, this is not a popular war inside Afghanistan. It's not one where people are egging on their team against the other and rejoicing when there's been mass casualties on the other side, as it were. But this could still go really badly wrong. And I think that the danger is absolutely there this year. And it's beholden on not just the regional and the international players, but also the senior leaders inside Afghanistan and all those people of good faith, both in the Taliban and in the civilian population and on the government side, to try and avert crisis and avert catastrophe. So at the moment, it seems that we are walking into catastrophe, and I say that with a heavy heart and with hopes that this will not happen.
Yeah. I put my mic on mute and forgot that I had, and tried twice, but couldn't manage it. But thank you so much. And I think it is the peace process, stop and start as well. It seems really emblematic of that. But thank you so much, Arif, Kamran, Kate, Ursula, Nemutullah, for giving so much of your time and your expertise. And I think there's been a lot of useful points that have emerged from this discussion. So number one, I think, is that there needs to be more clarity from the Biden administration in terms of what it wants to do with Afghanistan, where it wants to pick up the peace process. The peace process itself perhaps the nature of it could be changed. It ought to become much more inclusive. Perhaps mediators or guarantors could be included in order to make it much more sustainable. And I think one of the potential ways to influence the Taliban is through financial sanctions and cutting off funding. But I think the most important thing is that there is a lot at stake for the Afghans. It isn't just a region, a country that's been ravaged by war for far too long and has seen it all. And there's a narrow window of opportunity to resolve these issues. Thank you so much. Thank you for watching as well. And thank you to everyone who commented and asked questions.
Very good.